Hey everyone, Eric Uswa here for Summons from Gallifrey. This is a regular podcast focused on talking about Doctor Who. And in this episode, we're going to be covering some discussion points over the last story that we went through, which was Patrick Troughton's The War Games. It was his final story as the second Doctor. So first of all, just because it's on my mind, let's talk about the sniper at the end of episode 1. Now, in the novelization, Malcolm Hulke describes the sniper as a German soldier hiding in a random tree near the firing squad, for some reason because. But in the televised story, the sniper is shooting from a window overlooking the courtyard where the firing squad is set up, again, for some reason because. In both versions, there's really no follow-up or conclusion. You just have to assume that eventually the British soldiers take the sniper out. Kind of would have been nice to get a little bit of closure there, but whatever. That being said, it's a very well executed, no pun intended, cliffhanger. In fact, by and large, I found that the cliffhangers in general for the entire 10-episode story was quite strong. By the time the story was airing, while the news about Patrick Troughton leaving the show was not yet announced, I would imagine that maybe the rumor mill around Fraser Hines, who was playing Jamie, and Wendy Padbury, who was playing Zoe, were probably pretty strong. Meaning that while you might have known that they were leaving the show, you wouldn't necessarily know at which point they would be leaving. On that same topic, the BBC decided to make the announcement about Jon Pertwee becoming the new Doctor just before the last episode of the War Games aired. I wonder why it was timed that way. I guess looking at the viewing figures, I'm curious if the BBC were carefully watching those same numbers to make the decision on that announcement. Maybe the very low numbers of episode 8 forced their hand. Maybe they were probably hoping that announcing the final episode of Patrick Troughton, along with the promise of the series being made in color, would drive more viewers to check it out. You could argue that it kind of worked with the solid 5.0 million by the finishing episode of the War Games. By around episode 8 or 9, I think it starts to become a little clearer that the whole meat of the story is actually the introduction of the Time Lords. While the concept of the War Games is incredibly fascinating, I think it's mostly being used as a vehicle to get us to Gallifrey and to introduce us to the Time Lords. Terrance Dicks and Malcolm Hulke needed to create a situation so dire that the Doctor had no other choice but to bring in his own people. Terrance Dicks credits then producer Derek Sherwin with the actual creation of the Time Lords themselves. As an interesting footnote, Sherwin also ended up meeting and marrying Jane Sherwin, no relation, of course, who played Lady Jennifer Buckingham. Back to the story construction. I think it kept a good focus on one main War Game zone to flesh out and develop the idea and the characters, that being the 1917 zone. I think perhaps bouncing around between different zones would have maybe helped to create a sense of broader scope of the whole operation, but at the real expense of any kind of character development. It would have been incredibly difficult to keep track of events and characters bouncing between different zones. Not to mention, it probably would have meant a lot more of a production cost to create different set pieces for each zone. I think the show was really smart to focus on the barn from the American Civil War zone and the chateau of the 1917 war zone. Both of them were really well done set pieces. I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways, that the show likely stayed away from any World War II references, as it was likely far too recent in people's conscious memories. Not to mention that perhaps there were internal rules from the BBC that prohibited this area altogether. They played it safe and just left it as World War I. I do find it challenging with some Doctor Who stories to remember that its intended audience is mostly the young adult age, because I want to analyze it too much. I want to dig into it more than what I think is usually intended. I think, for example, in this case, the story concept really holds up, but I think a little more detailing could have been done in the televised version. For one thing, the sequence in the final episode with the warlord trying to escape in the TARDIS was just not needed. I felt it could have been chopped and maybe just ended with the warlord heading straight into his verdict and guilty sentencing, along with the dematerialization. Maybe they had to write it in because they found that the episode was too short. I don't know. That's a minor thing, though. I think one topic that's less minor is the actual usefulness of the War Games exercise itself. I think, again, the concept is very strong, and you immediately get pulled into a story concept like that, which I think really sells the epic label that they apply to the War Games in particular. However, when you think about it, what actual use is a Roman soldier from ancient Earth history compared to a World War I soldier? Or even compared to the existing armies of the warlord themselves, if there are any? I think maybe a little bit of focus or story development could have been done around the end game of the exercise. Like mentioning to us that the warlord's people are mostly a battle-hardened race that are preparing for this invasion of the rest of the universe. Maybe that they have a fleet of spaceships that are currently sitting half empty and are just waiting to use all of these human soldiers to help them out. Maybe instead of the processing machine just being responsible to prepare the subjects for the war games, what about having that machine train them for space combat? Maybe that would be a way that they would be eventually processing all of these humans. If you take a step back, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to grind out your potential candidates in something so resource heavy as World War I trench warfare, for example. Like, why choose the bloodiest war? While the first 5 episodes were very strong and very well constructed, I feel, the plot seemed to meander during episodes 7 and 8, with quite a lot of running around in the command center, but then picking up again for episodes 9 and 10, which I think were reflected quite well in the viewer numbers that we went through. Maybe instead of the constant bickering between the war chief and the security chief, there could have been more plot development around the strength of the warlord's armies, or even more behind the warlord himself. Despite him being the penultimate villain in the story, we don't really get much depth to him at all, which is kind of a bit of a shame, considering that the show was really trying to position this as such an epic adventure. Speaking of universe and galaxy, I could be mistaken, of course, but the script seems to use these two interchangeably. The Time Lords mention universe a few times, while I could swear that others in the script mention galaxy. But it could have been just an actor flubbing their lines. I don't know. Okay, so let's move on to some email that I've got in our mailbag. Remember, if you've got any feedback on any episode, you can send it to mailbag@summonsfromgallifrey.com, and I'll go through it on the show here. This one is from Robert in the UK. Robert writes, "Thank you for covering the war games. I did find it disturbing that for some reason the show thought it necessary to have the memories of Jamie and Zoe erased. How ghastly an outcome for the 2 companions." Thanks, Robert, and I 100% agree. It's barely acknowledged how invasive this is when you really think about it. And it doesn't make much sense story-wise either. They both don't present any kind of danger at all to the Time Lords, and they've already been returned to their own space and time. It's a very frightening and invasive thing to do to someone, and they just kind of gloss over it. It's a detail that I think the show just didn't need to pursue. It was enough to just leave them where the Doctor found them. The Time Lords already were established with a lot of powers that they demonstrated against the Warlord, so there wasn't really a need to remind the audience that they had this kind of power by wiping the memory of Jamie and Zoe. And that, my friends, is our discussion on the War Games. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you for spending a little bit of your day with me today. Be sure to join us next time when I tackle the first story of Doctor Who in color television, John Pertwee's Spearhead from Space. Be sure to leave a rating and review for this podcast to help the algorithm spread it around the network. That's all for me. Have a good one. Peace.